So our first speaker, it looks like, is Miguel Ortiz Delgado, presenting active moral conduct during a civil war on the just virtuous deeds of Cato of Utica and Ignacio Ramirez. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. And thank you for accepting my paper in these conferences. Very interesting, all the conferences. So I will speak in this presentation, a brief introduction, and then some biographical lines of the two characters, and then a comparison of 10 points of outlining the virtues and in this deontological and archetype point of view of the two characters, and then some brief conclusions. So I'm gonna share my screen.
Yeah, I can make you a co-host.
Thank you.
No worries. Should work now.
Okay, can you see? Okay. So here we go. Then, following the Argentine-Mexican philosopher Enrique Dussels' idea that, I quote, philosophy does not think philosophy thinks the non-philosophical, the reality, the historical reality, because it is a reflection on the philosopher's own reality. It starts from what already is, from his own world, from his system, from his speciality. Then I chose the lives of the Mexican Ignacio Ramirez, who lived in the 19th century, and the Roman Stoic Cato of Utica, or Cato the Younger, as exemplification of the possibility of an appropriate behavior on a personal level during an armed conflict, regardless of the political and ideological inclinations that anyone could have. So, reconsidering the idea of Marcus Tullius Cicero, that history is the source of proof and corroboration of different philosophical arguments, and this idea is shared by another thinkers, I argue that patriotism and adherence to a particular philosophy are two strong incentives for correct moral behavior, factors that could be stronger than even religion to practice a virtuous life. I developed this argument with a comparative study of the lives of these two characters, and well, at least this I tried to argue in the lives of Ramirez and Cato. Furthermore, as the philosopher Leopoldo Sea states, I quote, every philosophy has its torsion, its truth, and its historical conciliation, end of quote. I think Mexican liberalism, rationalism, and skepticism found its historical conciliation in Ramirez, as well the Roman Stoicism found its historical conciliation in Cato of Utica, as well as in Seneca or the philosopher Marcus Aurelius. So in the book, De Oratorium, Cicero establishes that the optimal speaker, orator, is a good guide, a moral guide for the human being, because through his speeches, he can assert that good actions are chosen in government. Agreeing with Cicero, the best speaker should always have knowledge of history and will make proper use of this knowledge. Thus, history could also be a guide for the human being, primarily in the art of government or in the achievement of real virtue. For Cicero, the virtue is a habit of mind. And I quote, it has four parts: prudence, justice, strength, and temperance. This comes in the book De Inventione. And he describes the virtue of prudence as a science, scientia, the virtue of justice as a habit, and the virtue of strength as an acceptance and a suffering, and the virtue of temperance as a domination. So the virtues are thus conceived as human acts, always applicable and applied to practical and political reality, and not to mere speculation. And this is, I propose, the same conception that, as we will see, held by Ramirez and Cato. So I first start with some bio lines of Ignacio Ramirez. Ramirez was born in 1818 in San Miguel Allende, the state of Guanajuato. In 1834, his family moved to Mexico City, where he studied arts at the Colegio de San Gregorio, where he also had a formation in philosophy, theology, history, and other disciplines. And he became fond of the ideas of the French encyclopedist. In his speech to access the Academy of Letran, which was an academy ecclesiastical, the adolescent declares himself an atheist and denies the existence of God, basing his ideas in the Latin Epicurean philosopher Titus Lucretius. In 1845, he began his journalistic career with the pseudonym El Nigromante, that means the necromancer, nigromant. And some years later, he, entitled the liberal newspaper Temis and Deucalion, publishes a very belligerent article entitled A los Indios, to the Indians, an analysis of the indigenous situation with a drastic moral. If they want to get out of their prostration, the indigenous only have armed rebellion as an alternative, then proposing some kind of violent resistance against the Mexican government. Ramirez is imprisoned for this article. Years later, in 1856, he served as a deputy in the Provisional Congress, and in his congressional speeches, he attacks the persistence of religious language in Mexican politics, legislation, constitution, etc. For the necromancer, it is ridiculous to consider some patriots as interpreters of the divinity. For him, divine right is written by the hand of the oppressors and is the pretext for slavery and ignorance. So on the eve of the first Mexican Civil War in 1857, he wrote another article against President Ignacio Comonfort, whom he considered to have distances from liberalism. Such president sent him to jail, but Ramirez, held by some liberals, escapes and flees to Sinaloa, the state of Sinaloa, but on the way he's caught by the conservative General Tomás Mejía, and in prison he's intimidated and suffers various humiliations, including parading on the back of a donkey and while the soldiers stone him. The Civil War of Reform began in 1858, and it was at the end of such year that Ramirez was released from the Tlatelolco prison after the liberals won this war. Where he lived in this prison, the harshest of miseries. When the French troops occupied Puebla in 1863, in the context of the Second French Intervention, the Second Civil War that Ramirez had to experience, the Mexican government left Mexico City and many troops went northwest. Ignacio Ramirez retired with them. At the end of 1864, he went to the United States and began a journey of several months in which he visited San Francisco and the Gulf of California. And by 1865, he's traveling between the states of Sinaloa and Sonora, writing against the empire and in favor of the liberal government. In 1866, shortly before the execution of Maximilian of Habsburg, here in the picture, in the left, he was again imprisoned in San Juan de Lua and later in the state of Yucatan, where he will become a victim of yellow fever. He then goes back to Mexico City, where he will continue to live under police surveillance. By 1866, he is appointed Minister of Justice and Public Instruction, And in his 2 years in office, he tries to reform the judicial and educational system, and he died in 1879, obtaining recognition from his enemies and his friends for his ability and his probity. Ramirez was a pragmatic man who was not inclined to speculations, but to give practical examples and advocate empirical and useful research for society. He directly attacked the study of metaphysics by asserting that, I quote, the abstract and hypothetical works in the first cause not only dealing with the origin of the universe, but in all matters lead to the most absurd opposites, end of quote. Ramirez then impressed his contemporaries and was described as Voltairian, demonic, stinging, satirical, derisive, a legend, a vigilante anti-hero. Then I will go on with some bio lines about Cato of Utica, or Cato the Younger. Cato was born in 95 before Christ from a noble family. By the time he was in his early 30s, he was already famous for being an uncompromising Republican and a ferocious opponent of the Populares, the faction of the Populares, and of anyone who breached the Constitution. Cato had rigid views of right and wrong, and he had no sense of humor. He was impervious to physical discomfort. Apart from the fact that he was a heavy drinker, like Socrates, he lived austerely. Seneca the Younger claimed that Cato the Younger even surpassed in practice the ideal sage of Stoicism, the Stoic philosophy. He ate as the modest Romans once ate, frugally. He dressed in black in contrast to the dandies who dressed in purple. He did not use basins or horses to transport himself, as he always went on foot to all the nearby places. He thus identified himself with the ancient Roman fortitude and incorruptibility. By 52, Rome seemed to be on the verge of falling into complete anarchy because of the struggles between the political leaders Claudius, Milos, Julius Caesar, and Pompey the Great. Cato considered that the latter was the only one capable of saving Rome from anarchy. Without falling into an unconditional support to Pompey's dictatorship, Cato proposed a legal solution where Pompey would have enough power to defeat the other political leaders. So the most unshakable traditionalist in the Senate squared the traditional Roman virtues with the global role that Rome now had as an empire. Cato effectively and actively opposed the reformers of the Constitution and the change of the Republican regime in Rome. The political activity, without concessions, shows his freedom of maneuver in contrast to many other members of his faction, the Optimates, who showed great fear and concessions towards Julius Caesar and his supporters. Caesar's civil war began in 49, among many other reasons, due to the deep personal enmity that many senators had between each other. At the height of the civil war, in 48, Cato, despite supporting Caesar's opponent, continued his declarations that the death of every Roman citizen must be lamented, regardless of the political side. So in the last years of the Civil War, Caesar marches to capture the port of Utica, and his surviving rivals from the Battle of Pharsalus, where and Utica was the base of operations of the Optimates and the base of operations of Cato. As I quote, "It will be a great propaganda coup if he, Caesar, could extend his clemency to this Cato, obdurate upholder of Republican values." Cato understood this too and was determined to prevent him. End of quote. Cato refused to parley with Julius Caesar because, in his words, the general is acting against the law when he pardons people over whom he has no authority. The Republican politician commits suicide in 46 and will inspire Brutus, another Roman fond of philosophy, to lead the conspiracy that effectively assassinated Caesar in 44 before Christ. Now, some 10 points of comparison between the two political figures and philosophical figures. Both participated actively in the civil wars of their respective nations. Ramirez in favor of a progressive party and Cato in favor of an ideology or political inclination that could be called maybe anachronically conservative. In such participation, they publicly lamented all deaths caused by civil wars, and they both insisted that war should be as short as possible and the less lethal possible. In Caesarean terms, during the civil wars, both practiced the suffering characteristic of the virtue of strength. Both suffered for the deaths in the civil wars. They never betray or change their political adherences or ideologies, not even during the dangerous times or urgent times of civil wars. In Caesarean terms, both practice the domain characteristic of the virtue of temperance. They never committed unjust or immoral acts against any political, military enemy or friend. In Ciceronian terms, both practice the habit characteristic of the virtue of justice. They conducted what we would call today as performance of virtue to attract the attention of public opinion in favor of their respective political, military factions and ideals. For example, Ramirez gave poverty performances and Cato gave a continuous performance by dressing in black or growing hair and beard as a sign of mourning for the death of republicanism in Rome. Here, a picture of Cato from the HBO series Rome that showed him in black. They both became the top representatives in their respective cultures of total freedom of thought and action, even during times of war. They were also paradigms of internal freedom since nobody was able to coerce or force them. Both practiced what the Stoics called the virtue of wisdom, and in modern terms, they also practiced non-violent resistance. On a personal level, they never agreed to collaborate or accept forgiveness from political leaders they consider immoral or unjust. For example, Antonio López de Santa Anna, here in the picture, Ignacio Comonfort or Maximilian of Habsburg in the case of Ramirez, or Catiline or Julius Caesar in the case of Cato of Utica. But because of their non-military civilian character, they never led a group of soldiers during civil wars. However, they did support some military leaders of their factions in some important battles. Ramirez supported General Gaspar Sanchez in the Battle of Mazatlan in 1864, and Cato supported Pompey during the maneuvers prior to the Battle of Pharsalus and supported Publius Varus in the Battle of Utica. In this case, both showed the science of military prudence. During the civil wars and also in times of peace, they strongly opposed personalist factions or parties, considering them unsuitable for their respective republics. That is to say that they always defended unconditionally a republicanism that must have political counterweights. Ergo, they became historical milestone of the defense of republicanism. And they fought against what today we call populism, coming from the left or the right, especially in times of war. They always obeyed the laws and the legality in the respective states, even during the pressing and difficult moments of the civil wars. For example, in 1865, Ramirez opposed the President Juarez, as this government was strictus sensu no longer constitutional, and was only supported by the military. In the case of Cato, immediately after the Battle of Pharsalus, he supported Cicero as the warlord of his faction, even over the more capable Pompey, and just because that was the legal procedure. Both became milestones of the defense of legality. They also refused to accept, for reasons of legality, any political order from the two most outstanding politicians of the respective times and countries. Ramirez refused to abide some orders made by Benito Juarez, even when the civil war was still on progress and Juarez was the leader of his faction. Cato refused to abide any order or mandate made by Caesar, the leader of his political enemies. Again, both practiced non-violent resistance. And finally, they were pushed to death by the civil war, and they faced such death with courage and contempt. Ramirez escaped from such destiny in 1867, the last years of the Mexican Civil War, by a very small margin. Cato accessed such fatal destiny by his own hand in 46 before Christ. Therefore, both are paradigms of the habit of strength, as Cicero describes the virtue of fortitude. So the two politicians reveal us how to carry out an always honorable, virtuous military struggle in favor of a particular political ideology, conservative or progressive, during a civil war. Both are symbols or historical symbols and proofs of a real virtuous moral participation and behavior during a civil war. They are the most comparable thinkers because both privilege the practical moral activity over theoretical work. Thus, we have seen that Ramirez and Cato practiced the virtues as they were described by Cicero. These virtues were born and materialized in Ramirez and Cato, I consider, coming from their patriotism and their unconditional adherence to particular philosophies, liberalism, rationalism, skepticism, or stoicism. The patriotism and the adherence to a particular philosophy are factors that I want to believe are not so difficult to replicate today. It is possible to fight virtuously in favor of a particular political regime during a civil war. That is, to fight a war without ever falling into vices or immoralities, at least in the personal level. I believe that it is possible to moralize, at least partially, by teaching the history of the practical virtuous deeds of outstanding people, and albeit idealistically, the history of moral deeds done in times of war is useful because effectively the study of history serves the moral improvement of any individual who analyze this history. Finding instances of edifying actions in the past, history moralizes. History, according to the German thinker from the 19th century, Johann Gustav Droysen, I quote, does not rectify humanity in a deterministic way. Rectification is only a possibility. End of quote. In truth, I consider, like Droysen, that the study of history constitutes a possible tool in combination with other tools to achieve the highest political purposes, as its subject of analysis is a meta-individual force capable of exerting an ineluctable and irreplaceable impact in human beings. And this cultural impact evidently includes the rulers of any nation and any epoch. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that really interesting and engaging presentation. If anyone has any questions, please either raise your hand or type question into the chat. Gail Presby.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for your presentation. So I just have a few comments and questions. So anytime someone's, talks about the virtue of patriotism, I mean, I feel like we have to be a little clear. I mean, if patriotism means, I love my country and the people of my country, and I'm willing to give my life for the people of my country, that can be a good thing as long as it doesn't just lead to international wars, like I'll defend people of my country so much I'll kill the others. I mean, I know some people say wars are justified, but I mean, patriotism, it seems to me, can sometimes be manipulated. And especially in a case of civil war, I would be concerned that both sides would declare themselves the patriots and they're fighting against the other side that's going to destroy the society. And sometimes maybe a virtue that's a little more cautious than patriotism would look at a situation from a more humanitarian perspective instead of a narrow allegiance to one side in a dispute. Now, I noticed that you said both of your people were nonviolent in the midst of the Civil War. So, I mean, that's very interesting to hear. And I wondered if when you call them nonviolent, you are using a contemporary idea of nonviolence and attributing it to their actions, or whether during their time frame they ever used the word or the concept nonviolence in the way that they spoke about the Civil War. And since you said they aligned with certain generals during the Civil War, I wondered if you could explain a little bit more what you meant by saying they each are examples of nonviolence. Well, I'll start with that.
Thank you, Gail, for your comment. I focus in the Civil War, and this is very different than focusing in the international world. It is a different dynamic, and the problem gets messy when it is a civil war that combines an international war, like in the Second French Intervention in Mexico. But having the idea of stoicism, that Hume or Ciceronian idea of just war, and this idea comes or arguments that for fighting a just war, you need to have some causes for this war, like just causes. And these causes are you have to revenge or some kind, not revenge or retaliation for some insult or aggravation that the country suffered, or your people. But if we concentrate ourselves in the idea that patriotism is the benefit of the people, of the civilians in your country, the Stoic idea and the Arethaic idea was that this benefit, you will achieve this benefit if you act virtually in commanding this war. Because if you don't act virtually, sometimes the public opinion will point you that you are not leading the war virtually, and the public opinion will go against you, and maybe the civilians will oppose this war because they are aware that that you are not respecting in modern terms the civil humanitarian rights or the rights in the war or whatever, and then the public opinion will increase this idea that you are fighting an immoral war, and then this idea increase, and the patriotism it gets well, the patriotism is not so strong to win to this idea of immoral behavior against some other people, or in a civil war and international war. And about the non-violence comment, briefly, both characters practice non-violence in understanding non-violence as opposition to the governments or rulers that they consider immoral and principally not legal leaders. So they both wrote or made speeches in the Senate or whatever against these rulers. And I think in this wide understanding of non-violence, not equal to civil resistance, just against I mean, civil resistance is the resistance against some laws, some legal presidents or rulers or whatever, in a deliberate opposition against these laws. But no, in the case of Cato and Ramirez, both made this non-violence resistance against rulers that they thought they were illegal in his ruling.
Great, very interesting. We probably have time for one more question before the next session, but hopefully, or maybe people can email you if they have further questions or message you in the chat. I actually did have a question as well, but Michael Tofta.
Yeah, so it should be a very quick question. So you were considering how virtuous these Cato and Rivera were in these particular situations, and showing how virtuous they were in a specific civil war. But then near the end, you mentioned drawing on their examples as not quite moral exemplars, but something to teach us about civic virtue and other aspects of virtue and nonviolence. I'm just curious, when in your look, did you see anyone who has been influenced by them that may be a counter position? Because obviously sometimes romanticizing past individuals, say like the founding fathers, sometimes portrays civic virtues today that even if they were quote unquote virtuous for the time, certainly wouldn't be someone that we would want to put up into some moral exemplar role in other contexts. And that's just a passing comment, obviously not too nuanced. I'm just curious if you ran across other things like that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, in general, stoicism nowadays, it has a great influence in politicians, and there are a lot of literature and publications nowadays about this stoicism and how they have influenced in politicians and in United States and other countries. And also in the case of Ramirez, he also influenced the current president of Mexico, for example, and other politicians here in Mexico. Yeah, maybe they are romanticized, but this is not a really strong problem, I think, because if we want to moralize, maybe sometimes we have to romanticize, idealize some figures. Thank you for your comment.
Great. Thank you so much again for your talk. And with that, we will move on to Michael Tofta, who will be presenting Fasting the Delicacy of War, the Socratic Introduction of War into the Republic's Peaceful Origins.
Yeah, thank you so much. Do you mind, Rachel, letting me share my screen quick? I think, yeah.
Yeah, I will make you a co-host.
Perfect. It looks like it's working now. I'm assuming everyone can see this now. Okay, so yes, so I'm going to be discussing, I'm taking a little bit different approach than some of the other sessions today, mainly because my specialty is going to be closer to the ancient medieval aspects. So I would welcome any other, especially contemporary framings that I can do to look into this. So I'm focusing on primarily book 2 of the Republic. My curiosity was piqued by how Plato/Socrates, depending on how you want to consider the origin and author of this book, introduces the necessity of the guardians, and by that, the philosopher rulers, war, all of these other kind of aspects, because it seems that the argument is not nearly as strong as some may seem, and I think it's less than convincing unless you have some type of implicit bias towards some of the premises or Hellenistic values or some aspects like that. So I'm going to quick walk through some aspects, why I'm interested in this, as well as my thesis and aim before considering the argument and my criticisms towards the end. If we have time, there's another section of this paper that I'll consider, but I can't imagine that will hit that. So when I was looking through some work for something different regarding Plato's Republic, I was hitting on a few. Actually, I was focusing on the laches, how Plato doesn't seem to consider idea that there could be a non-militaristic way of doing the virtue of courage. It seems like he just presupposes the idea of soldiery. But when I was looking into that, I started getting hit by a few of these other contemporary treatments of Plato's book 2 of the Republic, or just generally the Republic and pacifism, just generally speaking. And it seems that it's not necessarily the case that that Plato's understanding of how to create the city has to be with violence in this term. So Henrik Seiss in Plato, the necessity of war, the quest of peace, mentions like whether it is any way in which the path towards war could have been avoided in the first place. That is, we cannot help but ask Socrates agreed to debate the luxurious city at all, and did not stick to his original more austere and more simpler city, where there seems not to have been a need for war making in the first place. Claudia Baracci of Myth, Life, and War in Plato's Republic also mentioned that the philosopher, I believe, remember the context, specifically Plato and Socrates, without resisting their indications, must acknowledge Glaucon's desire, assent to it, and move on to the city of excesses. This is indeed a momentous concession. So I was very struck by these aspects, and then, but it seemed like outside of a few individuals, I can namely name, I believe it was Rosen, who mentioned that it was mainly an aspect of to placate Glaucon when trying to figure out where justice is located in the city, as per se a political theory and construction itself, as well as I believe he also said something about it seems to hint at the idea Socrates sees the healthy city be possible, maybe even more desirable. But besides a few notes like that, I didn't see anyone actually wrestling with the strength of the argument itself. So that's what I aim to do here, to analyze and criticize Book 2's pericope in, I believe it's 272 to 273 of the Stephanus numbers, but with the intention of testing its argumentative strength. As I said earlier, I conclude that the argument for the guardian class seems to be fairly inadequate and susceptible to criticism unless some other factors are in it that are not actually explicit in the argument. So either Plato's presentation of the argument is poorly constructed and framed in representing the original thought that Socrates is presenting, omitting aspects, editing aspects out, or Socrates is exhibiting an uncharacteristic traits of a poor epistemic agent. Also, the argument requires assumptions about values or pragmatic considerations, or these premises won't be supported until books 7 and 9, which splits the argument off in a way that I think is too weak to build up the argument to get to those points, potentially being circular, or at least just being weak. With that, I'll turn to the argument. So sorry, I said 272, 73. I meant 390. I should have meant 372, 373. So to begin with, there is this basic principle behind a Socrates polis, and it's the idea that a city comes to be because none of us is self-sufficient. The polis is structured around needs and what is necessary for humans to live, and that should be 369b. A city comes to be because none of us is self-sufficient. A city is not founded by any other principle. And here we see, if you're familiar with the origin of polis, every class is created depending on to meet some type of necessity, something that's not in there. Craftsmen, housemakers, shoemakers, farmers, aspects like that, and it builds up into traders and farmers and further craftsmen and merchants, but it's always strictly in this idea of what is actually necessary for political life and human flourishing. They doesn't try to introduce anything that's excessive in that, just trying to stick to what is necessary. So this is agreed upon between Plato, Glaucon, as well as the other interlocutors. But that's how we're starting off this city. The idea that citizens will bear no more children than their resources allow, lest they fall into either poverty or war, is even more not only supportive of that self-sufficiency claim that I was making earlier, but also the idea that poverty and war are both seen as either a devolution or a vice or some negative quality here, something that it should be avoided. So the idea is that if for some reason there's poverty or war, there has to be some reason to justify its existence, because otherwise it seems to be a negative making, poor making feature. It's not a good making feature of the city. So it's something that should be, this polis doesn't have. At the conclusion of the creation of this simple city in 372a-ish, 371e-ish, the idea that there's no war, there's no poverty. There may not be justice, and that's what Glaucon and Socrates seem to come to agreement, or at least it's hidden. But there is also no poverty or war. Before I move on, it's very important to mention that also the diet of the village notes that it's nearly vegan. It's at least cheese and meatless. There is a usage of leather, which I'm grateful for someone in my last conference to have mentioned and pointed out to me. But outside of that use of leather in a couple aspects, it's essentially vegan and vegetarian. And again, without poverty or war, suggesting a fairly close to a pacifistic environment if you're considering that as either a refraining from non-consensual human ending of human life and even animal life here. So it's a really important note, and this is the city that we've come to, and then here is the move as to why Socrates is moving away from that. So Glaucon accuses Socrates of constructing a polis barely fit for pigs. And he doesn't provide really any other reason, at least up front, than it is barely fit for pigs. Instead, actually, Socrates is the one who presents more of the arguments for it. But I'll read you to, he notes that there is, none of the following. Socrates forgot salt, olives, cheese, vegetables, figs, beans, aspects like that. So Glaucon's response is that these delicacies should be available, as their inclusion is to ensure that citizens do not suffer hardship. So hardship is what is going to, this avoidance of hardship is going to be what Glaucon is now saying to expand this necessity, this self-sufficiency principle. The idea is that it's not a case, it's a competing principle, it seems, it seems the idea that Socrates forgot these things because they're somehow included in this earlier principle of the construction, and we need to reevaluate the city in light of that. Further, but I will say it does seem that that the prima facie these delicacies as excesses seems to conflict with the original principle that self-sufficiency and available resources govern the polis's constitution. Glaucon is implicitly positing that the polis should not be concerned with sole survival, but also the well-being of one's life. So as long as these delicacies do not hinder survival or cause hardship, Glaucon would argue for their inclusion in the polis. So Socrates, and we'll pause and resume this fairly shortly, but Socrates accepts Glaucon's suggestion without much critical questioning. He only asks what kinds of luxuries Glaucon is desiring to implement. How should I feed these people? Socrates is also accepting that this new principle about delicacies overrides the original premise of necessity in some manner, that we have now found the origin of a luxurious city, and Socrates begins to reconstruct this polis. The former polis, based on necessity, is referred to as a healthy city and is set aside for the remainder of the argument in favor of this luxurious city. So whenever I use healthy city, luxurious city, that is essentially the two halves. The healthy city is the one that's essentially vegetarian, vegan, and it's based on solely the self-sufficiency principle, whereas the luxurious city also includes these delicacies, which, as a careful note, the delicacy can also in Greek be referenced to a fish dinner or a meat dinner. So there's also this connotation, not just of sweets, but also of meat. So it's actually, that language is actually connoting the introduction of violence towards animals at the very least, if not towards other individuals. From that, the luxurious polis that we're considering involves a large restructuring of the collective to incorporate the vocations necessary to produce those luxuries. The polis must be enlarged as the healthy one is no longer adequate, end quote. The polis now has a multitude of things that go beyond what is necessary for a city, also end quote. The problem is that the polis has already been constructed in a way that the city efficiently operates within the limits of its resources. Remember that there wouldn't even be an excess of children based off of this like self-temperance, self-moderation aspect. But now we have to introduce both a need for seizing some of our neighbors' land if we're to have enough pasture and plow land, because we only had enough land to sustain our city originally. Now, in order to sustain the delicacies as well as those who make delicacies, we need to seize more land. As well as we now have a need for doctors and other things to help temperate some of the excesses that the delicacies incur. So we no longer have this naturally self-moderating city. We have city that needs other aspects and features to moderate it. So, and in this, one should expect similar actions by their neighbors, referring to the seizing of some of our neighbors' land, whether in retaliation or because of parallel political reconstruction. This state of mutual seizure of resources moves the polis into a state of war. Socrates exclaims, "We've now found the origins of war." In response to the introduction of warfare, Socrates responds to the creation of a political class to address it, the guardians class, meaning that in his words, the city must be further enlarged, and not just by a small number either, but by a whole army. From this point on, Socrates is concerned with how the soldier class should be constructed, educated, involved in polis, and that will be pretty much beyond the scope of my paper. But now we're going to turn to the major features of the criticisms that I have of this, and I have three. Chiefly, basically they can be summarized in like three quick categories. The first is going to be concerned of how Socrates considers Glaucon's introduction and objection. It seems to be too quick and suggesting a poor epistemically virtuous response, or just not a sufficient argument, or one that's been strictly edited. So that's going to be focused more on the quality of the response and presentation. The second one will be seeing that there seems to be this, at least on prima facie concerns, this tension between the avoidance of hardship as well, but also the results of the city that comes about when we try to avoid hardship. And then the third concern is that it seems that one possible Socratic defense of why we have to expand this necessary definition seems to kind of lead to bad results if we look to Book 8, which would be necessary to do so. So no pun intended. So with that, I will consider the Socratic omission first, and whether Socrates is showing himself to be an epistemically virtuous agent. I find that Socrates in 372c to 373a to be out of character with his critical interrogation of definitions of justice in Book 1. His conversation with Glaucon, if considered a philosophical argument, is inadequate to refuting an ethical, political, or de facto pacifism. Up until 372c, Socrates has been considering the polis constructed to respond to a lack of self-sufficiency. Here he unreflectively commits a heel turn in a different direction with little substantial discourse to indicate his reasoning. This section begins with Socrates rearticulating his principle of the polis based on necessity in his quotation 372b through c, through applying it to the case of procreation as self-moderating population within constraints of available resources. Glaucon's immediate response, though, is the need for the inclusion of delicacies. Socrates agrees with a mild assent. True enough is the quotation that the John M. Cooper collection uses, and lists some examples that he had forgotten. My concern here is that these examples were not initially forgotten. They were not included as they simply do not fit the original parameters agreed to by Socrates, Adeimantus, and Glaucon that the polis was being constructed around. That being the case, there needs to be agreement on a new founding principle equal to or superseding this one to incorporate those delicacies. However, Glaucon's initial defense of the new principle is that the original polis is little more than a city for pigs. Glaucon's best opening argument regarding ideal political constitutions is based on decrying an alternative by animal husbandry comparisons. His proper defense of this new principle occurs after Socrates has already tentatively accepted it and already conceived it as providing benefits, peace and good health and old age. Despite and those are direct quotations, despite the principle being prima facie contrary to the argument's original trajectory. Before Glaucon offers this explanation, Socrates asks for practical clarifications of how, but not why, moving the conversation towards implementation, but not examination. In these 5 paragraphs, there has not been a defense of including delicacies beyond this is how humans have lived, despite the fact that one is creating the theoretical model of a city. This plays in stark contrast to Socrates' original advancement of political necessity as the basis of humans not being self-sufficient and the need for specialization of vocations. More concerning is the fact that Socrates quickly accepted the new principle, whereas in Book 1, he vigorously debates no fewer than 3 persons about their conceptions of justice and its benefits. Clearly, Socrates has accepted a change to the conversational rules of engagement in this section. The question becomes whether Socrates acted rashly, foolishly, unreflectively, or appropriately, but not presented in detail or some other evaluation. For that, I turn to the moment in which Socrates fully incorporates the delicacies into the polis. Socrates explicitly agrees to this restructuring. All right, I understand. It isn't merely the origin of a city, but the origin of a luxurious city, end quote. However, despite his agreement, Socrates tells Glaucon that this coming polis, the one which concenters the rest of the republic, is something akin to a fever. The luxurious polis is not the true healthy one, end quote, in Socrates' words, referring to the original polis discussed from 369b to 372c. Now Socrates' decision to continue with Glaucon's suggestion is not seemingly as obvious a well-reasoned one. Why select from 2 options, the one that is deemed to be fevered, where one option has already garnered collective approval of being healthy as well as true? Now, to be fair to Socrates and Plato's intentions, it depends on, I will admit that it depends on how you read the Republic. If it's a heuristic to examine justice, then it seems that Socrates has a more leeway to consider the fevered or luxurious polis because it's more exaggerated and will show the virtues better. Though it will be a concern, especially since Socrates and but later in books 7 as well as 8, does say, why would you look, some people falsely believe they have knowledge because they study images of the good, but not the good itself. So he will paint himself in a corner if you're considering ethical implications, especially normative ones, further. But if you read the Republic as some type of political constitution or political philosophy, there's even more of a concern that we are basing this we're basing this move as on such a quick examination, and we're trusting Socrates to balance out this fever as we go, instead of explaining why we should admit this fever when there was an already good alternative. We're not comparing the good alternatives. So that's the first criticism I have of this argument. Again, it doesn't completely refute whether or not Socrates or Plato is right about the guardian class or violence, but it does raise some doubts as to how strong this exists without some implicit biases. The second concern is this inconsistency with the avoidance of hardship. Besides Socrates' quick acceptance of Glaucon's proposal, accepting the luxurious polis leads to possible internal inconsistencies with the reasons Socrates and Plato give for its acceptance. As Socrates concluded his thoughts on the polis based on necessity, two good-making features are a lack of poverty or war. Similar features are mentioned in the discussion of the luxurious polis. Incorporating delicacies allows for peace and good health. There seems to be an implicit continuity of this idea of peace or lack of war and personal well-being as good for the polis, and that the inclusion of delicacies allows for its continued pursuit. Glaucon comments that the inclusion of delicacies is to help the citizens to not suffer hardship, making that the closest candidate for explaining the benefit in restructuring around delicacies. However, the description of the resulting polis seems to conflict with avoiding hardship, possessing peace, or facilitating good health. I've already mentioned the fever descriptor of the luxurious polis, but here the same descriptor seems to conflict with the good of good health and being a symptom of some disease or ailment. This is even more concerning when the new polis is not described as being an expansion of the health of the polis, but rendering the healthy one no longer adequate, end quote. Further, due to the change in diet towards delicacies, there is need for doctors to counteract the unhealthy dispositions that was not needed in the original polis. So the luxurious polis seems to be already dissonant with one goal without the latter introduction of the guardians and philosopher rulers to restore the health that was affected. Sure, health is restored, but why is it preferable for a person to move from already healthy to unhealth before having to introduce new systems to restore their original health? No further explanation is found here, and even Socrates' discussion of health in Book 10 does not follow that similar pattern. In addition to the health and fever conditions, I'm primarily concerned about the introduction of war to the polis, when the stated benefits of both cities are either the absence of war or the presence of peace. The luxurious polis does not simply permit the forcible seizure of land, it requires it in order to gain resources needed to sustain its inclusion of delicacies. Then we'll have to seize if we're to have enough, end quote. So warfare is essential to the operations of luxurious polis. There can be no pacifist polis that includes Glaucon's preferred delicacies. The essential need for resources in the luxurious polis produces the origins of warfare. Charitably, one may interpret this section about the absence of warfare, presence of peace, does not necessarily eliminate just actions of violence, say as like a just death penalty, but it does eliminate or suggest the elimination of a presence of internal discord or civil war and the condition of being threatened by external forces. Such an interpretation would not bar a just seizure of goods, strictly speaking, but empirically, the seizure is expected to be violent based off human history. However, Socrates does mention a condition of violent external threats and that other cities will do the same to this luxurious polis. Won't our neighbors want to seize parts of ours as well? End quote. Socrates does table discussion regarding whether the effects of war are good or bad, and does not return to consider war in the abstract, except in the context of a given political constitution in books 8 and 9. The foreign powers' motivations towards war evoke a negative implication. The foreign powers act because they have surrendered themselves to the endless acquisition of money and have overstepped the limit of their necessities. This criticism, and that's a direct quote, this criticism is not exclusive to other cities, as Socrates says they too, referring to this luxurious polis, painting it similarly. These portions reflect Socrates' later portrayals of undesirable constitutions of oligarchy and the acquisition of money, democracy and surrendering oneself to desires, and tyranny in the erotic pursuit of a single base desire that is not necessary. Socrates does set up his Callipolis to solve these issues and shows these lesser constitutions be devolutions of his preferred constitution. However, in reference to the moral evaluation of war itself, the implication leans towards a negative evaluation of the luxurious polis, using these later remarks. The final inconsistency brings the concerns of both the fevered state and the presence of warfare to bear on the undesirability of hardship. The fevered state and war challenge the good-making features of luxurious polis, according to Socrates, but the avoidance of suffering hardship is the one advanced by Glaucon. Even if the introduction of unhealth over health or warfare over peace were not explicit inconsistencies, they together still raise concerns with the desire to avoid hardship. The original polis was described as not having these possible hardships. Glaucon does not define hardship here, so appeals to the higher well-being of an individual are possible, but not certain or explicit. Instead, a plain reading of war and fever implies a danger or evil to most readers. The question raised is why Glaucon or Socrates does not fear a similar connotation. These noted inconsistencies are not without possible rebuttals from Socratic scholars. However, Socrates and Glaucon advance no explicit explanation to address some apparent internal inconsistencies. And my final criticism, the third criticism, my final main one here, is the defense regarding the necessary desires. One likely defense for Socrates' and Glaucon's position comes from Socrates' characterization of necessary desires later on in the Republic. If Socrates can show that these delicacies and their respective desires must be present necessarily in the good and or human life, then Socrates may be able to respond that my criticisms do not undermine the necessity of moving from the necessary polis to the luxurious polis, as drastic as it may seem. In Book 8, Socrates describes necessary and unnecessary desires. Necessary desires are those that a person cannot not pursue. In this quote, can't desist from, and to the extent that it benefit the individual. In contrast, the unnecessary desires are those that lead to no good or its opposite. The connection to the passage of 372 to 373 is that in both sections, he mentions the word delicacy, which is not mentioned otherwise, in that Socrates sees the desire for delicacies as necessary because it produces benefits to one's well-being. Socrates would therefore be justifying the move from the original polis to luxurious polis to being within the category of necessary that we were starting with, meaning that there is no, in actuality, not a dichotomy between the necessary and luxurious cities, as long as the definition holds. Glaucon's position is simply an expansion upon the necessary polis. First, this definition should have been presented in the initial argument move, though the discussion of necessary versus unnecessary desires is relevant to the democratic soul in Book 8. This assumption is also very critical for the account in 372 to 373, which is in itself critical to construct Socrates' Callipolis, which will be in light in Book 8's consideration of democracy. So though it may in fact address my criticisms of the philosophical content of 372 to 373, the absence of these definitions still supports my criticism of both the argument structure and Socrates' reasoning as presented in the dialogue. The second criticism here concerns the definition's immediate context being Socrates' criticism of democracy. The wording recalls the healthy versus fevered polis conversation with a discussion of delicacies. However, it is arguing that the Callipolis and the soul are not liable to the problematic excesses of the democratic. The immediate context here is that of an undesirable political constitution that Socrates rejects. Further, the full nuance of necessary desires, like delicacies, is that the desire for delicacies is necessary to the extent that it is beneficial. The excessive pursuit of them is the problematic mark of democracy. However, the luxurious polis was described through sharing similarities to foreign cities as also being surrendered to the endless acquisition. The original necessary features included in the polis self-regulate. The delicacies are the first to have the tendency towards excess. This direct association colors the introduction of the delicacies as originally described as something tending towards the undesirable and contrary to the necessity principle, making the initial move not an expansion of necessary without the additional introduction of the guardians. Perfect. So I realize I just went over a little bit of time. So let me stop right here. Sorry, I should have looked at my timer a little bit better. So if anyone has any questions, I didn't see the chat. So I will let people go for questions here. But that's basically, that was basically it anyways. It just was a roughy conclusion.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you, Michael. Is there an echo when I talk? I guess
A little bit, but you're fine.
if anyone has questions, please feel free to raise your hand or write them in the chat. And I just sent that message, so you didn't miss anything.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. Let's see. I'm seeing who that's from Gail. Thank you so much for that. Let me copy and paste that so I can look at that later. Yeah, Dr. Khan, if you had something.
Yeah, just a question. I thought maybe I'd come at this from a slightly different angle and see what you thought of it. I mean, is philosophy possible in the city of pigs?
That is that would be the that is definitely the criticism I've gotten from at least one professor before. The idea is that if our point is to look for either justice or potentially philosophy as some greater good, it does seem that if philosophy is corresponding to either the justice or the wisdom, and you need these other factors, it's not possible in the city of pigs, or at least we're agnostic about if it's possible.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it doesn't look like the individuals in the city are going to be capable of doing philosophy because they don't have time, right? They're each, you know, they're each making shoes or growing pulse and figs or whatever it is that they do, and that, you know, Socrates is able to be a philosopher precisely because he doesn't do anything else really. You don't have the right kind of conditions. But in addition to that, in terms of the bigger kinds of psychological things that are supposed to be going on, right? You don't have the development of thumos. And that seems to be tied to the guardians and the auxiliaries. And unless you've got war, you don't have philosophy. And if you don't have philosophy, you don't have true justice. So I mean, that's quite shocking. But it does seem like that's how it develops over the rest of the work.
Exactly. I think the criticism. So I had a discussion with like Dr. Eric Brown from WashU, as well as Dr. Weiland from UMSL on this conversation. It's not a convincing counter, but my counter would be simply the idea of, well, it seems like we don't. There seems to be a potential that there might be some other good, even if it's a lesser good, in you know, there's a good of philosophy and there might be a lesser good in just living this other life. And it seems just simply the case that Socrates and Glaucon don't wrestle with, is it truthfully the case that the good of philosophy is better than the good of the other, until you already make these assumptions. Yeah. And so I would make just simply the idea that it's not examined here, not a pun on the apology by any means here, but it just seems to not be examined whether that is the overarching value that trumps these other principles.
That sounds right. And Glaucon is kind of drawn into this, and maybe Socrates is deliberately doing this. He draws in Glaucon with something he knows Glaucon wants.
Yes.
Because if he just presents philosophy, I'm full, really, thanks. I don't need any of that. But when it's something that affects his desires, at least more tangible, immediate desires, he's more likely to come in. And the only other thing I would say is, I think you're quite right to bring up the idea of examined here too, because the problem with the city of pigs is that it only has the goods that are appropriate to pigs, right? This is not a life worth living, for humans, Toi and Poi. At least on the Socratic way of looking at things. Thanks.
And the session officially ends now, but if you both are happy to continue through the break, I'm happy to stick around. But it looks like Gail Presby has a question.
I'm okay with that, yeah.
Okay, well, just because Glaucon calls it a city of pigs, I don't know if that's fair.